The Holbrook mansion stood on a hill in the most prestigious part of town, surrounded by old maples and immaculately trimmed hedges. The massive wrought iron gates opened automatically, letting the homeowner's black Bentley through the winding driveway. Mercer Holbrook came home late, as usual. The lights were already on in the huge panoramic windows. Desiree never went to bed without waiting for her husband. She met him in the spacious hallway, impeccable even in her homemade silk robe. Her long blonde hair flowed over her shoulders, and a slight smile played across her chiseled face. 3 years ago, Mercer had first seen her on the runway during Fashion Week. Desiree was just beginning her modeling career, but even then it was clear she was created for a luxurious life. Natural grace, chiseled facial features, and a special fragile beauty made her stand out among other girls. After the show, Mercer made his way backstage, and a week later they had dinner at the most expensive restaurant in the city. She did not immediately agree to a date, spoiled by the attention of the model as used to the courtship of other men, but Mercer was persistent. He showered her with flowers, invited her to the best restaurants and private parties. His earnestness and thoroughness were tempting. In his 42 years, he had built a successful business from scratch and knew the value of every dollar he earned. Aiden Cassidy often joked about his friend's sudden crush. They had known each other for over 15 years, since they had started a small transportation company together. Now, Holbrook Logistics was one of the largest in the state, and the longtime friendship was only growing stronger. The wedding was lavish but private. Desiree shone in a dress from a famous designer, and Mercer could not take his eyes off her. They spent their honeymoon on their own yacht, traveling in the Mediterranean Sea. Now their life flowed in a measured and predictable way. In the mornings, Mercer went to the office, and Desiree took care of the house, met with friends, and visited spas. She gave up a modeling career. Her husband insisted that his wife should not work. However, she liked the role of social beauty. They often had guests in the evenings. Aiden was the most frequent visitor. He came to play billiards with Mercer and discuss the company's business. On such evenings, Desiree would go down to their home bar, serve drinks, and listen to their conversations, occasionally inserting a witty remark. Their marriage seemed flawless. Mercer gave his wife expensive jewelry, took her on trips, and fulfilled any whim. Desiree created comfort in their huge house and always looked great. They attended charity events and organized receptions for her husband's business partners. The mansion was gradually filled with art objects. Desiree had a weakness for modern painting. The spacious living room was filled with new abstract paintings, and the garden was filled with fanciful sculptures. Mercer only laughed at his wife's passion, but did not spare money. Every Sunday they had breakfast on the outdoor terrace overlooking the city. Desiree ordered fresh croissants from her favorite French bakery, and their cook prepared a perfect omelet and brewed aromatic coffee. At times like this, Mercer thought he had finally found the happiness he had been striving for all his life. He didn't notice his young wife looking out the window more and more often with an absent gaze, how she hides her cell phone when he enters the room, how her expression changed when Aiden arrived. After all, he had company demanding all his attention, and Desiree was the perfect wife, beautiful, devoted, and always there to support him. The day didn't bode well for trouble. Mercer spent it in the office, sorting out the usual business, meetings with clients, signing contracts, planning meetings with managers. In the evening, he stayed longer than usual, going over quarterly reports. Desiree had sent word that dinner was waiting for him at home. A light rain was drizzling. The highway was unusually empty for a Thursday evening. Mercer turned on the music and increased the speed. He wanted to be home soon. At that moment, a truck flew into the oncoming lane. A squeal of brakes, a sharp turn of the steering wheel, an impact. Desiree was awakened by a call from the hospital. She didn't immediately understand the meaning of the words. Accident, intensive care, critical condition. They wouldn't let her into the operating room. The hours in the emergency room stretched endlessly. She sat clutching her phone and mindlessly flipped through the photos from the morning Mercer kissing her goodbye, his smile, his eyes. Aiden arrived 20 minutes after her call. He busied himself with paperwork and talking to the doctors while Desiree nodded mechanically in response to the nurses' questions. The surgery lasted 6 hours. When the surgeon appeared, his face was tired and serious. Dr. Sage Montgomery specialized in severe brain injuries. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. Severe head injury, massive hemorrhage, induced coma. The chances of recovery were there, but extremely slim. Desiree listened without understanding the medical terms. She clung to one word: alive. The ICU was like a spaceship. Monitors, sensors, tubes entangling the motionless body. Mercer seemed asleep, only the bruises and abrasions on his face giving away what had happened. Desiree was only allowed to be around him for an hour a day. She talked to him, held his hand, told him the news, but all she heard in response was the hum of the equipment. Time stretched into an endless series of hospital corridors, talking to doctors and waiting. Desiree had lost weight, shadows under her eyes. She mechanically followed all the recommendations of doctors, signed documents, paid bills. At night, she lay awake in their huge bedroom, remembering every minute of their life together. Aiden took over the company. He came to the hospital every day, bringing coffee and trying to distract Desiree with conversation. She was grateful for his support. He was her only link to the outside world these days. Her friends called less and less often, and her social life seemed a distant dream. Dr. Montgomery did not give a clear prognosis. She's stable, but critical. The brain is responding to stimuli, but the extent of the damage is impossible to assess. We have to wait. And Desiree waited, counting days, weeks, months. She learned to understand the readings, learned the names of the drugs, knew by heart the schedule of each nurse. The mansion was empty. Desiree appeared there only to shower and change her clothes. There was an oppressive silence in the spacious rooms. The servants kept the house in perfect order, but it was as if the house was frozen, waiting for its master. Mercer's favorite billiard table was covered with a cover. His study was locked. Doctors said talking helped comatose patients. Desiree read Mercer newspapers, talked about the weather, recalled their first meetings. Sometimes she felt his fingers lightly squeezing her hand in response. She clung to those moments, convincing herself that he was listening, that he was fighting, that he would surely return. Weeks went by. Dr. Montgomery cautiously talked about the possibility of transferring to a specialized clinic. Desiree spent hours on the internet, researching stories of waking from comas, rehabilitation techniques, new research. She was willing to move her husband to the ends of the earth if it would help him. Aiden was supportive of all her decisions. He organized consultations with the best specialists, collected documents for transfer to a Swiss clinic. Desiree was grateful for his help. She couldn't have dealt with this nightmare alone. In his presence, it became easier to breathe. The world became more colorful, and the future did not seem so bleak. The Swiss clinic was like an expensive hotel. Spacious, bright corridors, friendly staff, a view of the mountains from the ward window. Desiree rented a small apartment nearby. She spent all day at the hospital, returning home only for the night. The monotony of the hospital routine dragged on. Desiree mechanically performed the daily rituals: morning coffee, talking to the doctors, reading aloud, massaging Mercer's motionless hands, lunch in the hospital cafe, reading again, massaging again. During breaks, she wandered aimlessly through the corridors or gazed out the window at snow-capped peaks. Aiden flew in every weekend. He brought news from home, talked about company business, dragged her out on the town. With him, it was possible to be quiet without pretending to be strong. He understood her grief like no one else. After all, Mercer was his best friend. One evening they lingered in a small restaurant in the old town. Desiree had a glass of wine for the first time in a long time. Aiden told her funny stories from her and Mercer's youth. She laughed, and for a moment it seemed as if life went on. As he walked her home, their hands accidentally touched. Desiree jerked her palm away as if from fire. Aiden pretended not to notice, but they remained silent the rest of the way, keeping their distance from each other. She forbade herself to think about that moment, but the thoughts came back again and again. The warmth of his hand, the faint scent of his cologne, the look in his eyes that was more than friendly. She couldn't sleep at night, tossing and turning in her empty bed. She awaited his next visit with anxious anticipation. Aiden showed up with a bunch of her favorite flowers. He remembered the ones she'd always put in her and Mercer's house. They'd spent the day at the hospital, and in the evening he'd suggested dinner at her house. Desiree had agreed, convincing herself that there was nothing wrong with that. They ordered food from the restaurant, opened the wine. The conversation flowed easily and casually. Aiden talked about new contracts. She shared the latest news from the doctors. At one point, there was a pause. Their gazes met, and Desiree realized that a second more and the irreparable would happen. She stood up abruptly, beginning to clear away the dishes. Aiden helped her, their hands touching again, and this time, she didn't pull away immediately. He left an hour later, leaving her utterly distraught. Desiree lay awake all night, tormented by guilt over the feelings she had experienced. In the morning, she went to Mercer's house earlier than usual, sat beside him for a long time, holding his lifeless hand, and wept silently. The weeks passed. Aiden flew in more and more often, explaining that it was company business. Desiree found herself looking forward to his visits, choosing her outfits more carefully, looking in the mirror more often. She began to put on makeup, going to the salon for the first time in a long time. Their meetings turned into an unspoken ritual: hospital, dinner, long conversations. They carefully avoided touching and too personal topics. But something subtly changed in the atmosphere, hung in the air with unspoken words, heavy glances, casual touches. One day, seeing him off at the airport, Desiree caught herself thinking that she missed him, not his help and support, but him herself, his smile, his voice, his presence. This thought frightened her so much that she canceled his next visit under the pretext of a cold. But he came anyway. He brought medicine, fruit, his favorite chicken soup from a restaurant near their house. He took care of her, read aloud to her while she dozed on the couch. In her half-asleep, she thought she felt his fingers in her hair, but when she opened her eyes, he was sitting in a chair across the room. Spring came slowly in the mountains. Desiree spent hours walking the narrow streets of the town, trying to sort out her feelings. She loved Mercer, there was no doubt about that, but loneliness and longing were taking their toll. Aiden was there, alive, warm, understanding. She didn't know how long she could resist the attraction. It happened on a rainy April evening. Aiden had arrived unannounced, just rang her apartment doorbell. He was soaked to the skin, water dripping from his hair. Desiree silently held out a towel, their fingers touching, and the next moment, she was in his arms. The next morning, she woke with a sense of the irreparability of what had happened. She went to the hospital as if she were being executed, unable to look the nurses in the eye. It seemed that every person she met could read the signs of betrayal on her face. Mercer lay as still as ever, his calm face a rebuke to her betrayal. Aiden flew away that same day without insisting on seeing her. Desiree spent a week in agonizing torment. She swore to herself that it wouldn't happen again, that she would be a faithful wife, that she would focus only on her husband's recovery. But when Aiden had called to say he was flying in again, her heart had thudded treacherously. Their meetings had become secretive and feverish. Now he was staying at a hotel across town. Desiree would visit him late at night after the hospital. They hardly spoke at all. Words seemed superfluous. In those brief hours, she forgot everything. About the hospital, about duty, about guilt. But in the morning, her conscience returned with redoubled vigor. Desiree would sit by Mercer's bedside for hours, looking at his gaunt face. She imagined him opening his eyes and realizing everything at once. The thought made her nauseous, but she couldn't stop. Their connection was like a drug. The more she got, the more she wanted. Aiden started flying in every week. They were discreet. No public meetings, no photos together, no social media trails. By day, she was a model wife, and by night, she forgot all about everything in someone else's arms. The hospital suspected something. The nurses gave her strange looks when she left earlier than usual. Dr. Montgomery asked her once, casually, if she was all right. Desiree began wearing dark glasses, hiding the evidence of sleepless nights. She hardly slept at all. When she did, she had nightmares of Mercer opening his eyes and looking at her reproachfully, or Aiden confessing to his friend, or the whole town finding out about their affair. She'd wake up in a cold sweat and stare into the darkness for a long time. For the first time in a long time, Desiree began to pray. She asked for forgiveness, asked for the strength to end the affair, asked for a miracle for Mercer. But she went back to the hospital during the day and to Aiden at night, as if some unknown force was pushing her into this vicious cycle. And then the thing she dreaded most happened. During another routine checkup, the instruments showed changes in Mercer's brain activity. Dr. Montgomery was cautious in his prognosis, but his eyes shone with hope. He spoke of signs of recovery, of a possible awakening, of the body beginning to fight. Desiree listened to him with growing dread. She should have been rejoicing, but instead, she felt the ground go from under her feet. That evening, she called Aiden and told him they needed to talk. He arrived on the first flight out. Their favorite restaurant was unusually crowded. Desiree mechanically stroked her fork across her plate, unable to swallow a bite. Aiden remained silent, waiting for her to speak. When she finally broke the news of Mercer's condition, he turned pale. They sat until the restaurant closed without making any decision. For the first time in their entire relationship, they talked about the future, about consequences, about feelings. They parted at dawn without coming to any conclusion. Desiree went to the hospital. Her husband would probably open his eyes soon, and she didn't know whether to rejoice or dread it. Mercer had come to his senses suddenly, just opened his eyes in the early morning when no one else was in the room. For the first few days, he couldn't speak, just stared out the window and listened to the nurse's enthusiastic lamentations. Dr. Montgomery called his return a miracle. Desiree tossed between the clinic and the hotel where Aiden was staying. She couldn't find the strength to confess to her husband, but it was beyond her to stop seeing her lover. Mercer watched her fuss in silence as she slowly regained the ability to move. Rehabilitation took 3 months. He worked with the tenacity of an obsessive. Machines, massages, exercises. Soon he was able to move around the ward on his own. The doctors marveled at the speed of his recovery. Desiree rejoiced at her husband's progress, not noticing the change in his gaze. Aiden flew in to say goodbye, explaining that he needed to get back to the company's business. Mercer received his friend with unusual warmth. They talked at length about the business, making plans for the future. Desiree watched their conversation, feeling a vague uneasiness. A week after Aiden left, Mercer announced that he wanted to return home. Dr. Montgomery didn't object. Physically, the patient had indeed recovered. Desiree spent the last night at the hotel, burning letters and deleting messages. The mansion greeted them with silence and coolness. Desiree bustled about, making her husband comfortable. He hardly spoke, immersed in his thoughts. In the evening, she found him in his study, sitting at his computer, looking through some files. He came up to the bedroom at midnight. Desiree had already dozed off when she felt his presence beside the bed. She opened her eyes and saw a cell phone in his hand with a picture of her and Aiden in that Swiss restaurant. You could see mountains and a lake in the background. She didn't have time to scream. A pillow covered her face, strong hands holding her tight. She tried to break free, but months of physical therapy had made it stronger than before. The last thing she heard was his calm voice. "I know everything, honey. About the hotel, about your meetings, about everything." The body was discovered by the maid in the morning. Mercer had already left for the office, had to get back to company business. The police arrived 20 minutes after the call. Detective Finley Rourke was the last to arrive. He'd been called as soon as it became clear it wasn't a natural death. Rourke looked around the bedroom, noting the perfect order. No signs of a struggle, save for a crumpled pillow. The victim's cell phone lay on the bedside table, screen unlocked. Body's still warm, so it's a recent death. The husband was the first to be questioned. Mercer was calm, detailed his early departure to the office. Yeah, his wife was alive when he left. No, he didn't notice anything unusual. Yes, they had just returned from Switzerland, where he was in rehab. Rourke listened, making notes in his notebook. Something about the widower's demeanor seemed wrong to him, too collected, too calm for a man who had lost his wife. And this trip to the office on the first day back home. By late afternoon, the body had been taken to the morgue. Forensics continued to work in the bedroom, but the findings were scant. No prints, no DNA traces, no obvious evidence. Everything looked like the work of a professional, but Rourke's intuition told him that the clue was somewhere nearby. He stayed in the mansion until dark, looking at the family photos on the walls, a happy couple on a yacht, wedding pictures, social gatherings, and the last photo is of Desiree in a Swiss hospital, holding her husband's hand. She's smiling, but her eyes show concern. You're absolutely right. Rewriting the chapter, focusing on the really important details. The second day of the investigation began with a thorough examination of the crime scene. Rourke returned to the bedroom early in the morning as the light fell from a different angle. No traces were found on the pillow used to smother Desiree. Whoever the killer had been had acted with gloves. Perfectly clean room, no prints, no evidence. Forensics worked methodically, examining every inch of the space. There were distinctive marks on the victim's body. The killer held her tight, she fought back. So the perpetrator was extremely strong. The maid, Martha Chapman, had worked at Holbrook House for 5 years. She said that the lady returned from Switzerland in high spirits, talked a lot about the miraculous recovery of her husband. The night before, Desiree had asked all the servants to leave early. She wanted to be alone with her husband. Mr. Holbrook has changed a great deal since his illness, Martha added after a pause. He used to always joke with the staff, ask about our families. Now it's like he's petrified, and that look in his eyes. I'm sorry, detective. I don't mean to speak ill of the owner. The butler confirmed Mercer's early departure for the office, but added an interesting detail. The owner had gone out the back door, although he always used the main entrance. When asked why, Mercer said he didn't want to make noise and wake his wife. Neighbors had little to add. The family on the right had gone on vacation a week ago. The elderly couple on the left heard some noise in the night, but thought it was the wind. The only useful testimony came from the neighbor's gardener. He saw a car pull out of the Holbrooks' garage early in the morning. By lunchtime, Rourke had his first theories. The main one is that the husband committed the murder. The motive was not yet clear, but his behavior was alarming. Too calm for a man who'd lost his wife. Too quick to return to work. His alibi was too clear, as if he'd been preparing for it. He requested materials from Switzerland, surveillance tapes from the clinic, hotel bills, any documents related to the Holbrook family's stay there. He was especially interested in the last months before his return. The pathologist sent a preliminary report. Death was caused by asphyxiation between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. The body showed signs of a struggle, bruising on the wrists. The victim fought back, but the attacker was much stronger. The victim's only friend, who was contacted, hinted at a man's frequent visits to Switzerland, but she did not give a name, only said it was someone close to the family. Rourke requested passenger lists for all flights to Switzerland over the past year. In his office, Rourke laid out the crime scene photos. A perfectly made bed. The maid swore she hadn't entered the bedroom this morning. Pillow without a pillowcase. Where was it? An open window, though Desiree always closed it at night. Little details were adding up to a picture of the crime, but there was still no evidence. A strange letter from a travel agency in Switzerland appeared in Rourke's mail. An anonymous person had sent a photograph taken by chance in the background of a local restaurant. In the background could be seen Desiree Holbrook sitting too close to a man who was definitely not her husband. The detective spread the documents out on the desk, looking over the case file once again. The rain was drizzling outside the window, and the department was unusually quiet. Half the staff had left on other business. Rourke rubbed his tired eyes and enlarged the photograph for the 10th time. He recognized the man at once, Aiden Cassidy, Mercer Holbrook's closest friend and business partner. His partner, Sergeant Morris, brought coffee and new printouts. The company's finance department had finally provided the corporate card statements. Aiden had flown to Switzerland 17 times in the last 8 months, too often for normal business travel. One time he'd paid for a hotel room with a corporate Carta suite overlooking the lake. The conversation with an old family friend, Gerald Pierce, had taken place in a small bar near the property. He had just returned from a business trip to Switzerland. Pierce was silent for a long time, twirling a glass of whiskey in his hands. Then he spoke. I saw them together in a cafe on the seafront. They were kissing, thinking no one knew them in a strange city. I didn't know what to do. Mercer was lying in a coma. Aiden was his best friend. When Mercer woke up, I told him. I had to tell him. The day dragged on slowly. Rourke checked alibis of witnesses, made phone calls, reviewed surveillance tapes. Morris brought sandwiches from the cafeteria, but they remained untouched. Aiden was called in for questioning later that evening. He was confident, acknowledging his visits to Switzerland, visiting a friend in the clinic, supporting his wife in her time of need. But when the detective put the photograph from the restaurant in front of him, Cassidy turned pale. "We loved each other," he finally admitted. "It didn't happen right away. She was so lonely, I just wanted to support her. Then things got out of control. When Mercer woke up, we decided to call it quits. I flew home a week before they came back." Rourke closed the deposition folder and walked to the window. The rain had intensified, turning the streets into mirrors. Somewhere in the city, a murderer was walking free, and all they had was circumstantial evidence and a confession of treason. Morris coughed quietly, drawing attention. She was sitting at her computer, reviewing surveillance footage from the Swiss clinic from Mercer's last few days there. She was particularly interested in the moment of the conversation with Gerald Pierce. The pathologist sent back a final report. Death by asphyxiation. The marks on the body suggest the killer was cold-blooded and methodical. The victim resisted for about 2 minutes, then lost consciousness. Rourke took off his jacket and loosened his tie. It was going to be a long night. The email came in the morning. The receptionist at the Alpenrose Hotel was responding to the detective's repeated request. "I must report a strange detail," he wrote. "A week before discharge, Mr. Holbrook called on us from the clinic. Asked about Mr. Cassidy's residency, dates of his visits, wondered if he was alone. Said he was conducting an internal audit of the company." Rourke reread the letter 3 times. Mercer knew back in Switzerland, gathered information under the guise of a corporate audit, planned it. The detective pulled the phone records from the clinic. Here it is, a call to the hotel, 6 minutes long. Same day, another call to an airline, reservation for home. The next day, a call to the housekeeper to get the house ready for his return. It all fit. Pierce told Mercer about the affair. He started gathering evidence. Methodical, cold-blooded. Checked the hotel. He must have seen that tourist photo, convinced he'd betrayed his wife and best friend. Morris brought Desiree's phone records from last week. A long conversation with Aiden the night before he came home, then another from home the day before the murder, and the last one an hour before she died. The picture of the crime was getting clearer and clearer. Mercer came home knowing about the affair. Didn't show it. Let his wife believe their secret was still out there. And at night, went up to the bedroom and smothered her with a pillow, strong enough after months of physical therapy to handle the resistance. Rourke began to reconstruct the events of that night minute by minute. 10 p.m., the servants leaving at Desiree's request. 11, last call to Aiden. Between 2 and 3 in the morning, murder. 5 a.m., Mercer leaves for the office through the back door. 7:30, maid finds the body. "You were right about the timing," Morris said, reviewing camera footage from neighboring houses. The tape vaguely showed a figure coming out of the back door of the Holbrook mansion around 5 in the morning. The motive was crystal clear: revenge for betrayal. Not mere jealousy, but cold-bloodedly planned retribution. Mercer waited until he got home on purpose. He wanted to kill her in their bedroom, in their bed, where she had cheated on him, even if only mentally. The detective remembered their first conversation after the murder. Now he understood Mercer's strange calmness. He had already gone through everything, made his decision, and carried out his sentence. All that remained was to play the part of the inconsolable widower. Rourke had assembled the materials for the prosecutor. The call to the hotel is proof of premeditation, security footage, proof of timing, forensics on the body, evidence of physical strength, Pierce's testimony, motive, a story of betrayal culminating in death. Morris handed him another printout, a list of incoming calls to the clinic. "Look," she pointed to one line. A call from Aiden the day before Mercer woke up, a long conversation with the nurse. And the next day, the patient regained consciousness. "He could have heard," Rourke muttered. "Could have heard them talking the whole time." And then he got confirmation from Pierce and went into action. The last thing left was to get a signed statement from Aiden. Rourke dialed his number, but the phone was disconnected. Just in case, He sent a patrol car to his house. The conspiracy of silence was collapsing, and all of its members were to meet in the courtroom. Aiden Cassidy sat in the interrogation room, tapping his fingers nervously on the table. He had slimmed down over the past week, shadows under his eyes. This time he was accompanied by his lawyer, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit. "There's something I need to tell you," Aiden began, ignoring the lawyer's cautionary gesture. "I should have done it sooner, but I couldn't believe Mercer was capable of this." He'd been talking for nearly 2 hours, about how their affair with Desiree had begun, about long conversations in Swiss cafes, about her loneliness and his unexpected crush, about the plans they made to leave together while Mercer lay in a coma. And then he woke up. Aiden's voice shook. "We decided to end things immediately. Desiree wanted to confess everything to her husband, to start fresh. I flew home so I wouldn't interfere with their reunion." Rourke listened silently, making notes. Gradually, the picture became complete. "She called me that night." Aiden clenched his fists. "Said Mercer was acting weird, that she had a bad feeling. Asked me to come over in the morning. I talked her out of it, told her it was just nerves, that things would get better." In the adjoining interview room, Mercer Holbrook was waiting. When the detectives entered, he was reading some papers, calm, collected, in an immaculate suit. On the desk in front of him lay an arrest warrant. "I assume you have evidence?" he asked in an even voice. Rourke laid out before him the printouts of the calls to the Alpen Rose Hotel. Mercer barely glanced at them. "I heard everything," he said suddenly. "Every conversation they had in the room, every phone call, every whisper. The doctors say it happens in a coma. Consciousness partially returns, but the body doesn't obey. Can you imagine that, detective? Lying motionless and listening to your wife plan a future with your best friend?" He spoke quietly, almost emotionless, but there was a strange glint in his eyes. "Then Gerald came in, told me about the photos, about the hotel. I already knew, of course, but now I had confirmation, proof." Morris turned on the tape recorder. The confession should have been recorded. "I waited until everyone was asleep, went up to her. She woke up when I was already holding the pillow. You know what she said? 'I'm sorry.' Like that was enough. As if one word could fix everything." Mercer fell silent. A heavy silence hung in the room. "You were planning a murder back in Switzerland." It wasn't a question. "I was planning retribution," Mercer corrected him. "She betrayed me when I was helpless. Aiden betrayed our friendship. They deserve to be punished." "Why exactly that? Why not a divorce?" "Divorce?" He grinned for the first time. "It was too easy. I wanted her out of my life the way she came into mine. In our bedroom, in our bed. Where the betrayal began is where it ended." Rourke motioned the papers toward him. "Write down everything you've told me from the beginning." Mercer took the pen. His hand didn't tremble. Cops with handcuffs were waiting in the hallway. Aiden was still sitting in the next room. He'd insisted on waiting until the interrogation was over. As Mercer was let out, the former friends met eyes. Neither of them uttered a word. "Case closed," Morris said, gathering up the papers. Rourke nodded. The story of love and betrayal had come to an end. All that remained was to file the paperwork and take the case to trial. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The courtroom was full. The case had attracted the attention of the whole town. Mercer held himself impeccably, answered clearly and calmly. At the last session, the judge asked him the main question: why his wife? "Because she was mine," Mercer answered, looking straight ahead. "Aiden is a stranger, a traitor, nothing more. But Desiree, she swore her loyalty to me, promised to be there for me in sickness and in health, and then she betrayed me when I couldn't even open my eyes." He was silent for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "You know what the worst part is? I heard them. Heard her telling him words of love, the same words she told me. Heard their plans, their dreams for the future. They were building their happiness while I lay between life and death. Aiden. He just took what wasn't good enough, but she gave away what was mine." The jury deliberated briefly. The verdict is guilty of first-degree murder. Sentence is life in prison without parole. Holbrook Logistics went into receivership. Aiden quit the day after Mercer was arrested. He was said to have sold his stake and gone somewhere in Europe. Dr. Montgomery published a study on the consciousness of coma patients. He used Mercer's case as an example that people in this state can perceive what is going on around them much more fully than is commonly believed. Gerald Pierce often visited Mercer in prison. "He hasn't changed much," he told Detective Rourke upon a chance encounter. "Still as collected, calm. Only the eyes, it's like something in them has gone out forever." The Holbrook mansion was auctioned off. The new owners started a large-scale renovation, completely changing the interior. There was no trace of the old life. Rourke occasionally pulled out the case file, reread the testimony. The story of a man who came to his senses to kill. It wouldn't let him go. "I didn't set out to kill Aiden," Mercer had said at the last meeting. "His betrayal is his cross to bear. Let him live with it. Let him wake up every day thinking that his cowardice and lust cost the life of the woman he supposedly loved. It's worse than death." The town discussed the story for a long time. Some pitied Desiree, some excused Mercer. But gradually the talk died down. New dramas and new stories emerged. Only in cell number 321 did the man every night, picking through the rosary, a gift from his wife on their first anniversary, and remembering the time when he had been happy, when he believed in love, and in friendship too.